Stop chasing closure. Stop explaining your pain to someone who already heard you and chose distance anyway. Because here's the truth no one told you when you were begging for answers, Sue. The silence you're afraid to use is the one thing they feel the most. You thought your words were powerful. You thought your honesty would reach them. You thought if you just said it better, calmer, softer, they would finally understand. But avoidant partners don't break from confrontation. They break from absence, not absence of love, absence of access. And if you've ever wondered why walking away quietly felt more painful to them than all your tears combined, this is the moment where everything finally makes sense. You were never weak for speaking. You were never wrong for trying to explain. You were never foolish for believing honesty could save the connection. But here's the hard truth that hurts because it's real. Every word you gave an avoidant partner handed them emotional control, not because they were smarter, not because they were stronger, but because they were more detached. Avoidant partners don't engage emotionally the way you do. They regulate themselves by pulling away, by minimizing intensity, by creating distance when closeness feels overwhelming. And when you speak, when you explain your pain, your needs, your confusion, you unknowingly step into a system where they hold the upper hand. Why? Because words invite response, and response is something avoidance can manipulate. They can delay it. They can soften it. They can intellectualize it. They can ignore it. Every message you sent gave them options. Silence gives them none. When you were speaking, they knew where you stood. They knew you cared. They knew you were emotionally available. They knew no matter how distant they became, you were still there, still open, still waiting. That certainty gave them comfort, and this is the part most people don't want to admit. Your emotional availability made their avoidance sustainable. Silence destroys that system. The moment you stop reacting, truly stop, something destabilizing happens inside them. Not because they suddenly miss you romantically, but because the emotional environment they relied on disappears. Avoidants don't feel safe through closeness. They feel safe through control, control of pace, control of depth, control of engagement, and silence removes all three. When you don't respond, don't explain, don't seek clarity, you interrupt their nervous system. They can't tell if you're hurt, angry, healed, or gone. And that ambiguity forces them into a state they hate, emotional uncertainty. Words keep you predictable. Silence makes you unknowable. And unknowable is threatening to someone who survives through emotional distance. This is why your silence feels louder than any argument ever did. Not because it's cruel, not because it's strategic, but because it removes the emotional feedback loop they depended on before they could pull away and still feel your presence. Now, when they pull away, there's nothing, no reassurance, no emotional supply, no proof you're still waiting. And that absence exposes something they've spent their entire life avoiding, the possibility that they actually lost you. Silence isn't punishment, it's consequence. It tells the truth without saying a word. It says, I am no longer organizing my emotions around your distance. I am no longer performing vulnerability for someone who won't meet it. I am no longer giving you access to me without reciprocity. And here's the part that changes you, not them. When you stop speaking into emotional emptiness, your nervous system begins to reset. You stop bracing for replies. You stop rereading messages. You stop waiting for tone, timing, and crumbs of validation. You regain internal authority. Silence doesn't just remove their control, it returns yours. That's why it feels so uncomfortable at first, because for the first time, you're not trying to manage their emotions. You're choosing yourself, quietly, firmly, without explanation, and that quiet choice. That's what they feel the most. Every time you tried to explain yourself, you thought you were building a bridge. You believed that clarity would create connection. You believed that if they could just hear you properly, something inside them would soften. But with an avoidant, words don't build bridges, they build exits. They don't use language the way you do. For you, words are an attempt to be seen. For them, words are tools to manage discomfort, to control emotional distance, to escape intensity without looking like the villain. This is the hidden truth most people never realize until they're exhausted and empty. Every explanation you give an avoidant hands them a way out. When you speak, you offer them material. Material to analyze instead of feel. Material to debate instead of confront. Material to minimize instead of absorb. They don't have to sit with your pain, they just have to respond to it. And responding is something they're good at. They can sound reasonable while staying emotionally unreachable. They can acknowledge your feelings without actually touching them. They can say, "I understand," while remaining unchanged. That's not because they're evil. It's because avoidant attachment is built on survival, not intimacy. Words activate their defenses. Silence bypasses them. When you speak, their mind switches on. It starts organizing, reframing, distancing. They listen just long enough to regain control, not long enough to be impacted. Your vulnerability becomes something they manage rather than something they feel. Silence doesn't give them that option. Silence gives them nothing to respond to, nothing to reframe, nothing to reduce into logic. It leaves them alone with the one thing they avoid most, their own internal reaction, and that's where the real impact begins. Because avoidants are experts at avoiding emotional confrontation with others, but they are far less skilled at avoiding it within themselves. They rely on interaction to regulate. They rely on conversation to keep the emotional temperature low. They rely on your presence to stabilize their distance. When you stop speaking, you remove the structure they depended on. Now there is no argument to win, no explanation to dismiss, no reassurance to lean on, only the question they can't silence. What does their absence mean? Words keep things negotiable. Silence makes things final, even when nothing has been said. That's why silence feels so heavy to them. It carries implications they can't control. It suggests boundaries they didn't approve. It implies a shift they didn't initiate. And avoidants hate not being the ones who decide the distance. When you were talking, they could always tell themselves, they still care. They're still invested. They're not going anywhere. Your words were proof of your availability. Silence erases that proof. Now they don't know if you're angry, healing, or emotionally gone. And that ambiguity forces their mind to fill in the blanks, usually with the very outcome they fear but never admit. Loss, not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind. The kind that happens without closure, without confrontation, without permission. Silence doesn't attack them, it removes you. And removal is what they can't rationalize away. When you spoke, they could say, they're emotional. They're overthinking. They're asking for too much. Those labels protected them from accountability. Silence offers no labels. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't beg. It doesn't demand. It simply withdraws access. And once access is gone, something shifts in their perception of you. You are no longer the person waiting to be understood. You are the person who may have understood enough to walk away. That's the moment words could never create. This is why arguments rarely change avoidance, but distance does, because arguments keep you present. Silence introduces the possibility of absence becoming permanent. And permanence is the one thing they can't talk their way out of. Silence also forces time to work against them. Words create immediacy. Silence stretches moments into meaning. Every unanswered space becomes a mirror. Every quiet hour becomes an invitation to reflect, not because they want to, but because they have nothing else to distract themselves with. You didn't need to convince them. You didn't need to prove your worth. You didn't need the perfect sentence. The moment you stopped explaining, the truth became unavoidable, not because silence is louder, but because it removes the escape route words always provided. And whether they ever admit it or not, that absence lands deeper than anything you could have said. You didn't lose them because you were too quiet. You lost them because you kept trying to make sense out of someone who survives by avoiding sense. And here's the truth that cuts deeper than any explanation ever could. Avoidants don't fear abandonment the way you do. They fear abandonment without closure. That difference changes everything. They can handle distance when it's controlled. They can tolerate separation when it's on their terms. They can survive emotional gaps when they know exactly where they stand. What destabilizes them isn't loss, it's uncertainty. And silence creates uncertainty in its purest form. When you were speaking, they always knew where you were emotionally. Even when they pulled away, your words tethered you to them. Your attempts to clarify, reconnect, or repair acted like a signal: I'm still here, I'm still available, I'm still emotionally open. That certainty made distance safe for them. Silence removes that safety. It introduces a question they can't answer and can't escape. Are they gone for real? Avoidants are wired to manage relationships by regulating proximity. Too close, they pull away. Too far, they may hover, but only if they feel in control of the space. Silence disrupts that regulation. It takes the measuring stick out of their hands. Now they don't know if the distance is temporary or permanent. They don't know if the connection is paused or finished. They don't know if you're hurting, healing, or already moving on. And that not knowing activates something deeply uncomfortable in them, because closure is how avoidants keep their emotional world tidy. Closure lets them compartmentalize, label, and move forward without emotional residue. It allows them to say, that chapter is done, even if it was never fully felt. Silence denies them that narrative. Without closure, the relationship doesn't end cleanly in their mind. It lingers. It remains unresolved. It becomes an open loop, and open loops demand attention. They can't file you away. They can't rewrite the story. They can't convince themselves you were the problem. Because silence doesn't argue, it just exists. And existence without explanation is threatening to someone who relies on logic to avoid feeling. This is why silence often triggers delayed reactions in avoidance. Not immediate panic, not dramatic pursuit, but a slow, unsettling discomfort that grows over time. At first, they tell themselves it's fine. They distract themselves. They rationalize. They stay busy. But eventually, the lack of closure catches up. They start replaying moments. They wonder what you're thinking. They question whether they misjudged the situation, not because they suddenly became emotionally expressive, but because silence leaves too much room for interpretation. And interpretation forces introspection. Words would have given them a version of events they could accept or reject. Silence gives them none. It leaves their mind to fill in the gaps, and the human mind, when left without information, tends to assume loss. This is the paradox avoidants live with. They crave autonomy, but they need certainty to feel safe. Silence threatens that certainty without taking their autonomy away, which means they can't blame anyone but themselves. When you leave loudly, they can frame you as dramatic. When you leave angrily, they can frame you as unstable. When you leave quietly, they have no frame at all, just absence. And absence forces them to confront something they spend their lives avoiding: the emotional impact of their choices. Silence doesn't chase them into reflection. It removes the distractions that kept reflection at bay. They are left with the echo of what you used to provide emotional availability, consistency, presence. And because it disappeared without a scene, without demands, without final words, it feels more real. Final words can be argued with. Silence cannot. It also disrupts their sense of control over endings. Avoidants often end relationships in ways that protect them: slow fades, emotional distancing, unresolved maybes. These endings allow them to exit without fully engaging with the emotional weight. Your silence flips that script. Now they didn't get to decide how it ended. They didn't get to manage the narrative. They didn't get to emotionally detach on schedule. The ending happened without their consent, and that lack of control is deeply unsettling. Silence tells them, without saying it, that the relationship no longer revolves around their comfort, that the emotional labor they avoided is no longer being performed for them, that the connection they took for granted is no longer accessible. It doesn't ask them to change. It doesn't demand accountability. It simply closes the door they assumed would always stay open, and doors that close quietly tend to echo the longest. This is why silence isn't about making them miss you. It's about removing the emotional certainty that kept them detached. It forces them to sit with the consequences of distance without the buffer of explanation. They may never admit it. They may never reach out. They may never articulate what they felt. But internally, the lack of closure leaves a mark, because silence doesn't give them a way to end things comfortably. It leaves them with the one thing they never learned how to sit with: an ending that wasn't on their terms. They told themselves they didn't want the chase. They told themselves they wanted peace, space, freedom. They told themselves intensity was the problem, not distance. But here's the truth most avoidants never consciously admit. They didn't reject you. They rejected the responsibility that comes with being chosen. And as long as you were emotionally present, they never had to face that responsibility. Your availability made their avoidance comfortable. Your consistency allowed them to stay inconsistent. Your effort created a dynamic where they could withdraw without losing connection. This is the part that hurts to realize. But it's necessary. They weren't staying because they felt secure. They were staying because they didn't have to pursue. The chase was happening quietly, one-sided, and constantly. You were adjusting. You were reaching. You were initiating. You were trying to keep emotional closeness alive while they kept emotional distance intact. That imbalance was the relationship. Avoidants don't feel threatened by someone who stays. They feel safe around someone who adapts. When you're always there, always responsive, always willing to explain, they don't have to move toward you. The emotional gravity pulls in one direction, and it isn't theirs. Silence collapses that gravity. The moment you stop reaching, the system breaks. Not dramatically, not immediately, but fundamentally. Because the chase they claimed they didn't want was the very thing keeping them emotionally regulated. It allowed them to remain distant while still being desired. It gave them reassurance without vulnerability. It let them feel important without feeling exposed. When you remove that pursuit, you don't just disappear, you disrupt. Now there's no one closing the emotional gap for them, no one translating feelings into safety, no one maintaining the connection on their behalf. And suddenly, the distance they created becomes a problem they have to deal with alone. This is when their internal narrative starts to shift. Before, they could say, they're still here. They'll reach out if it matters. I can take my time. Silence removes all of that. Now they don't know if you're waiting. They don't know if you care. They don't know if they missed their window. And that not knowing hits a nerve they didn't realize existed. Avoidants are comfortable being wanted. They are deeply uncomfortable being optional. Your silence turns desire into absence, and absence forces choice. Either they move toward what they distance themselves from, or they sit with the reality that they let it go. And that's the moment things get heavy, because moving toward you requires vulnerability. It requires acknowledging impact. It requires stepping into the emotional space they avoided. But staying still means accepting loss. And loss without drama, without confrontation, without a final fight feels different. It feels earned. Silence doesn't provoke them. It reveals the cost of their behavior. The chase was never about ego. It was about emotional regulation. Your attention soothed their nervous system. Your efforts stabilized their avoidance. Your presence allowed them to stay detached without consequence. When you withdraw that, they're left to self-regulate, something they've always struggled with. This is why silence often triggers delayed pursuit, not because they suddenly want intimacy, but because the emotional environment changed. The comfort zone collapsed. The familiar dynamic disappeared. They may not rush back with words. They may not confess feelings. They may not even reach out right away. But internally, something shifts. They begin to notice your absence in moments you used to fill. They feel the lack of emotional cushioning. They experience the distance they once controlled as something imposed, and that inversion matters. Silence doesn't chase them. It forces them to decide whether they will chase, and decision-making is hard for avoidance because it removes the option of emotional neutrality. Choosing means investing. Choosing means risking exposure. This is where many avoidants stall. They hover. They think. They test the waters. They may even convince themselves they're fine, until time passes and the silence remains, because silence isn't a tactic that expires. It doesn't demand response. It doesn't escalate. It simply holds its ground. And the longer it holds, the more it confronts them with a truth they avoided while you were present. The relationship existed because you sustained it. Once that sustaining force is gone, they have to face whether they're willing to step forward or accept that the connection ends here. That realization is uncomfortable not because it's dramatic, but because it's honest. Silence doesn't beg them to choose you. It shows them what life looks like when they don't. And whether they act or not, that moment leaves a mark, because for the first time, the chase isn't happening for them. It's happening inside them. You didn't just lose them. Somewhere along the way, you lost yourself, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, through compromise after compromise, explanation after explanation, moment after moment where you swallowed what you felt so the connection wouldn't break. And that's the part no one talks about enough. Being with an avoidant doesn't just distance you from them. It distances you from who you were before you started trying so hard. You became more careful, more patient than you felt, more understanding than was fair to you. You learned how to soften your needs so they wouldn't feel pressured. You learned how to wait without asking. You learned how to accept inconsistency and call it space. And each time you did that, something inside you moved further away from its natural center. Silence is where that drift stops, not because silence is strong, but because silence creates space, and space reveals what you abandoned while trying to be chosen. When you stop explaining, something unfamiliar happens. You start hearing yourself again, not their interpretations, not their half answers, not the stories you told yourself to make the distance feel survivable. Your own voice comes back. At first, it's uncomfortable. Silence feels empty because you filled so much of that space with effort. You were busy managing the connection, anticipating moods, adjusting expectations. Without that role, you're left with a strange question you haven't asked in a long time. What do I feel when I'm not trying to fix this? That's where dignity begins, not as pride but as alignment. Dignity isn't about proving you're unbothered. It's about no longer abandoning yourself to maintain access to someone else. Silence becomes the boundary where your emotional labor finally ends. You stop performing calm. You stop packaging pain into palatable sentences. You stop negotiating your worth through clarity. And slowly, something stabilizes inside you. You realize how much energy you were spending just to stay connected. How much of your identity revolved around being patient, understanding, the safe one. How much of your self-worth became tied to whether they stayed emotionally reachable. Silence interrupts that dependency. Without constant interaction, you begin to feel the shape of yourself again, your preferences, your instincts, your emotional limits. You start noticing what actually feels good, what feels draining, what feels dishonest. This is the part people misunderstand. Silence doesn't just protect you from them, it reconnects you to you. And that reconnection changes the way you carry yourself. Even if you never speak another word, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. You're no longer bracing for replies, no longer scanning for emotional cues, no longer shrinking your reactions to keep the peace. You become steadier, and steadiness reads differently from detachment. It has weight, it has gravity, it has presence. That's why silence often changes how they perceive you, not because you disappeared, but because you return to yourself. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional shifts, even if they don't articulate them. They feel when the dynamic changes. They sense when you're no longer orienting around them. When your energy stops reaching outward and starts settling inward. That shift is visible, not through words, through posture, through tone, through absence of urgency. You stop feeling like someone waiting to be chosen. You start feeling like someone who has already chosen themselves. And that self-choice carries a quiet authority. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It simply exists. Silence teaches you something words never could, that you don't need to be understood by someone who won't meet you emotionally in order to trust your own experience. You don't need agreement to validate your feelings. You don't need closure to move forward with integrity. You begin to see the relationship more clearly, not through longing, but through perspective. You recognize patterns you excused. You acknowledge moments where you minimized yourself. You notice how often you compromised without reciprocity. That awareness isn't bitter, it's grounding, and grounding is what restores dignity, not the performative kind that says, "I'm fine," but the embodied kind that says, "I know who I am even without this." Silence becomes the space where self-respect grows back. You stop measuring your worth by their responsiveness. You stop interpreting distance as a reflection of your value. You stop bending your truth to fit their comfort. And once that happens, something irreversible occurs. You can no longer go back to who you were before. Not because you're hardened, but because you're cleared. You understand now that love without presence isn't intimacy. That consistency matters. That emotional safety isn't something you earn by being patient enough, and whether they ever come back or not becomes secondary. Because the most important return already happened. You return to yourself. That's why silence isn't weakness. It's not avoidance. It's restoration. It's the moment you stop leaking energy into a connection that couldn't hold it and start building a relationship with your own boundaries, your own needs, your own emotional truth. And once you stand there grounded, aligned, whole, you don't need words to prove anything. Your presence does it for you. Thank you for staying with me through this message. Thank you for listening with an open heart, especially if some of these words touched places you've been carrying quietly. If you felt seen, understood, or less alone even for a moment, then this time mattered. Remember this as you move forward. You were never too much, too emotional, or asking for the impossible. You were asking the right person to meet you at the wrong depth. And choosing silence now doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you finally started caring for yourself. Take this with you gently. Let it settle. You don't have to rush healing, explain your growth, or justify your boundaries to anyone. What's meant to understand you will feel your shift without needing a word. Thank you for trusting this space. Thank you for honoring your own journey. Until we meet again, protect your peace, trust your clarity, and remember who you are becoming. Goodbye for now.